I worked for Northamptonshire Archaeology Department when they had one. And then I went off and worked in the music industry. My father was a history lecturer at Nain College, as was, and then later on at the OU. So history and Northamptonshire generally run in my family, and it's something I'm certainly interested in. In fact, I was brought into this project really by my brother, who worked for Scottish and Newcastle, who were the last major owners of what had been Phipps. And he and his deputy, a guy called Edward Theakston, who was of the Theakston brewing family in North Yorkshire, had the idea to rebrew Phipps IPA. And they realized that the company hadn't got any history or any recipes because it had all been jettisoned by Watners. So I was brought in 2004 to research Phipps recipes. And here I am now, well, 20 odd years later, talking to you good people. And that's the story. So I'm going to just take you through, in a sense, the history of brewing, very briefly, the early history, and then concentrate on Northamptonshire. So don't worry, it won't go on too much longer. So if we go to the first slide, I think it's fascinating to realize how long beer has been with us. I think beer has been with us as long as there's been agriculture, as long as there's been settled human society. And it is also interesting to note that the earliest recorded common name, not a king, not a priest, but a name of a person, is actually Kushim from 3400 BCE in Uruk in Mesopotamia, which is now in Iraq. And if you can see the picture of the little clay tablet, his name in a hieroglyphic form is the top left-hand two symbols. One looks like a sort of triangular spade, and then there's an arrow above it, and that says Kushim. And he was an accountant or a scribe or some official at the temple in Uruk. And oh, hello.
Oh, yeah.
And if you look left at the bottom, you can see the Mesopotamian word for brewery, which is a stylized form of barley in a pot, and that says brewery. So this is a tablet recording the amount of bushels of barley that are brought into the temple for the temple brewery. So that's the beginning. I think beer and brewing was not an invention so much as a discovery. If you grow grain and crops, mainly barley, and you boil them, you make a porridge first off, and then you leave the porridge in your cave and it's still warm. Wild yeasts from the air, lambic yeasts as we would call them, will land on that and they will start to ferment it. And hey presto, you have beer. So all around the world, this characteristic of barley and wheat was noticed, and beer has been with us on our journey for better and ill ever since there has been anything. So I'm going to skip through possibly ancient Egypt, where brewing was also very large. The people who built most of the monuments were paid in beer to a large extent. Obviously, brewing in Europe, especially in Northern Europe, was very much associated with the Germanic tribes and the Anglo-Saxons, whereas wine culture was going on in the Roman world, but brewing happened everywhere. And in Britain, see, I've just done about 5,000 years now, going through to Britain after the Romans left and when Christianity took hold and monasteries started. Brewing at volume, which is what, as a commercial brewer, I'm interested in, brewing at volume really started in monasteries, where you had a large number of people able to work, usually in agricultural land, bringing in crops. So the monks brewed, and you still get that tradition in Belgium today to some extent. But obviously Henry VIII ended brewing in monasteries and ended monasteries. And after that, in Britain, the people that brewed to any large scale, other than at your home or in your local inn, would have been farmers. And before mechanization, when farmhands came in to get the crops in harvest time, most farmers had small brew houses. Certainly the bigger ones did, and they provided weak, sweet nourishing beer, which would be taken out into the fields in the hot late summer and early autumn time. So farmers kept the tradition and knew how to do it. And that is a very neat 5,000-year trip right up to our next slide, please. If that's possible, thank you. So here we go. Now, the Phipps family were farmers in North Oxfordshire and South Northamptonshire and had been for some time. They're quite a prosperous bunch. They had farms all around Towcester. And to be a farmer in 18th century and early 19th century England was to be in the healthiest profession you could ever be in, to some extent, because you had access to food, you were generally healthy. So lots of children and only one farm to hand down. So what does the second or third son do? They do other things. They become possibly maltsters. So they actually start adding value to some of the products of the farm. And one of the Phipps sons opened a maltings in Towcester in the late 18th century, and then opened a pub. And everything might have just stayed on that level. You would brew in a pub, you would brew in your farm. Things haven't mechanized. We're in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. And the catalyst for change in brewing, as in so many other things, was coal. Coal power to heat, coal power to boil, but also coal power to move. And what needed to happen for that to have an effect on the brewing industry was there to be a ready supply of cheap coal. And obviously Northamptonshire doesn't have coal mines, but Leicestershire, Warwickshire, further down, further up, there is coal. So what you get is the canal system being built. And the dates are very interesting, that when the Grand Union Canal reached Stoke Brewing, a coal stave was set up there. And the price of coal in that area of Northamptonshire dropped dramatically. Absolutely 2/3 of the value went down, because before that it was being carried in either on pack horses or on very long winding journeys from the northeast up the navigable Nen. But all of a sudden you had canal barges coming down from Leicestershire with coal. And immediately, literally, the year later, the Phipps family decided to start a brewery in Towcester. So in 1801, they started a coal-fired brewery to increase the level of production of their beer, not just for their own pubs and their own maltings, but to start to sell it. And they would sell it out and about in a narrow sort of, I'm going to guess, 10, 15 mile radius around. And as you can see in this Towcester brewery picture, you can see the horse and cart leaving the brewery yard. And I don't know how familiar some of you people will be with Towcester, but what we're looking at in that lovely picture of the original Phipps brewery, which is mostly gone, but the house on the left, which is the Phipps family house, is still there. And the building next to it, which has got 2 chimneys on it, that is still there. That was the brewery office and the pay office. Everything else has gone, and it's now I think it's an old people's home called Brewery Court. So that's where the Phipps family were. Everything was great and super, and it was Pickering Phipps who was running it from 1801 until 1817. Doing well, prosperous, everything's going well for Pickering Phipps. So if we move to the next slide, and here we are. So because you used for this talk the Phipps poster, I thought I'd use something different. And this is, we now move to Northampton. Now, exactly the same thing happened in Northampton as happened in Towcester 16 years later. What we call the cut between Blisworth and Northampton on the Grand Union Canal arrived in Northampton in 1816. And the price of coal in Northampton dropped dramatically. And one of the things that happened was the shoe industry started to mechanize because you could power the machines. The coal staves were where Latimer and Crick is now, on that southern banks of the river originally. So all of a sudden, the properties on what had been sort of the road out of town, Bridge Street, suddenly became valuable properties. They became places you would base industry. And for instance, over the road, an ironworks started, and various other manufacturers and small shoe things happened all the way up to where Bridge Street starts to climb into the town properly. So there was a gentleman in Northampton, a gentleman businessman called Mr. Barrett, and he had 3 other partners, and they were all corn merchants and general businessmen in the town, and they spotted the same opportunity that Phipps had spotted to start a big new coal-fired steam brewery. And often these breweries were called steam breweries if it was the sort of the hip AI or iPhone steam brewery. You put steam in front of it and it showed you were at the cutting edge. So they raised the funds and they started to build this brewery, and by all accounts they pretty much finished it. But 3 of the 4 businessmen got into financial difficulties because they were corn farmers, and the corn laws were up and down, and it's in the post-Napoleonic period of a little bit of turmoil, leaving one of them with most of the debt and none of the ability to go forward. So he decides, Mr. Barrett puts an advert in what was then the Northampton Mercury and Herald as it later became, advertising that he was not going to start the business, but he was going to lease it or sell it. And he crowed in that wonderful old 19th century way, "Ladies and gentlemen, I beg leave to tell my good county folk that the finest brewery built of the finest craftsmen, complete in all goods and chattels for the pursuance of the art of brewing, shall be auctioned this day, ... So we know, we obviously, Pickering Phipps down in Towcester, read this, heard about this. And we pretty much know what he did next. He gets on a white stallion. And that may seem like a frivolous little detail, but having a white stallion was a bit like having a Rolls Royce or the top of the line BMW in those days. And there are quite a few photographs of pictures of Pickering Phipps on a white horse. So he obviously fancied himself. So he trots up from Towcester to Northampton and he wins at the auction. And he gets this brand new brewery, complete in every way, that hadn't worked. So he now has 2 breweries, which is odd and interesting and was quite revolutionary at the time. And whether he was smart enough to know this, I suspect he was, because clearly he was a good businessman. The distance between Northampton and Towcester at this point was perfect. You could just about get from one to the other comfortably in a day to oversee your 2 businesses. But the 2 breweries wouldn't compete with each other because still, at this point, as you can see in this photograph, the beer you were brewing was going to be delivered around the county and the area in horse-drawn wagons on bumpy, unmade up, unmetalled roads. And really all you could do is get about 10 miles away. You know, no motor transport, no A roads really, just bumpy roads. So he had these 2 breweries and he started to run both of them. And it went even better for him. And he got economies of scale when he was buying in malt. Now, of course, Northampton is a bigger place than Towcester, the bright, shiny lights. So within a few years, Pickering moves up to Northampton because it's more important. It's becoming bigger. And he moves into a house next door to the brewery. I think if we go to the next picture, I think that will. And this is a picture that you've probably all seen because there are cards made of it. And it's a little bit later than we're talking about now. So this is probably late Victorian times. But you can see the original Phipps Brewery is the 3rd building from the left. One is the pub. Then you've got some houses, which were where the managers lived. And then you've got the original 1817 brewery there. And you can see how close it is to the coal staves, the river, and how easy it will be to get malt in and hops in, because hops for Phipps would come up the canals the opposite way to the coal. They'd come from Herefordshire mainly. And eventually they might even come from Kent, from London. So it's a great place to put a brewery or any sort of business at this point. So the Phipps family move up there. and they become wealthy. Not quite Elon Musk wealthy, but very much it was the right place and the right time to start a brewery, because Northampton was growing into an industrial town. The terraced houses in Phippsville and around it in Kingsley would be on the horizon soon. Shoe factories were growing up, coal smoke everywhere, and it was pulling in the population from the agricultural industry in the county, which was also mechanizing to some extent with traction engines. So if you ran a brewery, you really pretty much had a license to print money. It was a great time to be brewing beer. And Phipps became wealthy. And I mentioned earlier on that the healthiest occupation in Britain in the 18th century was being a farmer. The healthiest occupation in the 19th century was being a brewer. And the principal reason for this is that brewers, even to this day, never drink water, and they don't give water to their families. They drink small beer, table beer, very weak beer. And in an era, as we know from all the cholera epidemics in London, when the water source was generally tainted with all sorts of terrible things because we hadn't really worked out the sanitary system of the towns that grew, and we certainly didn't know about microbes in water. Brewers had many, many children, and they all survived. And Pickering had 9, and his sons all had 5, 6, 7, 8, and his grandsons all had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So within a couple of generations, the mid-19th century, Northampton is crawling with Phipps. You just couldn't avoid the little. They must have been like rather annoying little princelings, wandering around the town, being wealthy, probably being a little bit obnoxious. Certainly some of them we have records of certainly were. And the family became a business family. They spread out their tentacles, if you like. They started Phipps and Sons, which is where the Derngate is now. That they never made their own shoes, but Phipps and Sons were shoe mercers. They made everything else, like from cardboard boxes to chemicals to dyes to eyelets. So they sort of joined in the general growth of the shoe industry and made a fortune there. They also own the ironworks and the iron mines in Hunsbury Hill. And where the Acre Centre is, the Hunsbury Hill model farm, that was a Phipps farm. It's where mainly they looked after the horses, both for the brewery and also for the ironworks. And it's rather sweet. The horses that delivered 6 days a week then always had Sunday up on the farm, and they bred their own horses there. They also made their own barrels and did the woodworking. So it was a family that had its fingers in pies. And what goes with wealth at that time, and probably even now, well, definitely even now, is power, a lust for power. So Pickering the First became mayor of Northampton and an alderman, and the family was generally active in politics in Northampton. Pickering Phipps the Third, which was the grandson, he laid the foundation stone of the Guildhall. They were instrumental in founding the County Club, which is on Wood Hill. They built the first swimming baths in Northampton, which was on Bridge Street, using the same heating system as the brewery. And as I know, we have a Phippsville person here. Later on in they developed Phippsville as an area, built churches, built houses, and obviously they built pubs all around Northamptonshire. So they were a very, very prosperous family, very happy, very good, very wealthy. And now we move on to the next story, because into every life we need a little bit of rain to fall. And for the Phipps family, this building is the rain falling. This is the Northampton Brewery Company, Phoenix Brewery. It's actually an etching, which we ended up finding and actually having some new prints done, but it's slightly worn because it was used for advertising. So it's about an 1860 etching of the as-built Northampton Brewery Company. Now, I'm assuming some of you people may be Northamptonians and remember the Phipps NBC or Watney's Brewery. This building was at the top of Bridge Street, more or less on the corner now. It was opposite Mulliner's Garage. And it was started in 1857 by the Phipps brothers. Now, they were attracted to the same part of Northampton for the same reason Phipps was. And the difference was the Phipps brothers came from a brewing family, and they had members of their family had breweries in Burton-on-Trent and in Coventry and in Stamford, where the Phipps brewery lasted right through until the 50s, I think. And the two of the Phipps brothers moved to Northampton. And what they had that Phipps didn't have was the knowledge of how to brew pale ales, Burton ales, as it was called. Because up until the 1840s and 50s, really, most British beer was quite dark. It was a porter, it was a stout, it was just a dark, heavy beer. You couldn't see through it like stout today, like Guinness today. And that didn't matter. That didn't matter if you were drinking from a ceramic pot, a leather jug, a wooden bowl, a pewter tankard. Doesn't really matter what it looks like up in the light, because all you see is the top of the head. But in Burton-on-Trent, because of the gypsum in the natural water, it lends itself to producing clear, sparkling beers. The solids in the malt and the grain and the work drop out quickly, so you can get clear beer. And this is the industrial era. And the other thing that needs to happen for this to be an interesting point is the industrialization of glassware. So Pilkington start mass producing glass. So into the pubs of the mid and late 19th century Northampton and Britain comes glasses. And once you've got a glass, you can hold your pint up to the light. And even though it might taste the same as the other guy's beer, it looks sparkling. And this is the era when sort of white sugar and white bread were thought to be better for you because it was clear. So clear Burton pale ales were thought to be better for you than the dark, heavy ones. Completely untrue, but it was a fashion. So the Phipps brothers come to Northampton and they start brewing sparkling ales. And because this is before the Schools Act, a lot of people would be illiterate. So they start using one of these newfangled early trademarks, and they used a star in the same way that some other brewers like Allsops used a red hand or a diamond for Eindhoven. They used a star, which meant their beer was sparkling. And for a while, the Phipps family, who'd had it all their own way for 40, 50 years, suddenly were rocked by the success of NBC Brewery, this newfangled upstart. And just a little note here, by the way, if you look at the picture, you can see that there is a lost, well, it's all lost now, a lost arm of the River Nen was actually dug out to give the NBC Brewery its own little wharf. That was later filled in the 1930s, and it became what they call the top yard, and the lorries would actually go in there and malt would go in and beer would go out. So I think we can move on to the next slide. And isn't this a lovely, fine gentleman? And this guy is Samuel Lipscomb Secombe. Now, he was an entrepreneur. He was an architect by training, and then he became a property developer. He was originally from Oxford, but he moved to Northampton, and he, around the area, not just in Northampton, but in other towns, he developed housing estates, and he built homes, and he became fabulously wealthy. And he lived in Wootton Hall, which is now the County Records Office. And he had, as you can tell, I don't know if he was in the army. I think he might have been in the militia. I don't think he was ever in the army, but he obviously fancied himself, a bit of a Donald Trump character, perhaps. And he became a shareholder in the Phipps brothers business. And that happened in 1868. But by 1874, he was the major shareholder. And the Phipps brothers had just sort of lost control of their own business. Some of their sons stayed in it. But Samuel Secombe and his family became major players, and they owned NBC. And he bankrolled the company. And he became the sworn enemy of our next slide. Here is our beloved Pickering Phipps. In Phipps now, we do love Pickering because he was an absolute He was a complete nasty bit of work, but you gotta love him. He was the grandson of the founder, named after him, which he wasn't the eldest son's son, but he was the second oldest son's son. And he was 6'4", I believe. Well-built man, very short temper. As a youth, he got into trouble. He was thrown out of public schools for fighting and drinking. He became an MP until recently. Certainly, he was the first MP to be arrested on the floor of the House of Commons since the Civil War, because he had a fight on the floor of the House of Commons. And his tactics in business were just as heavy-handed, shall we say. So he decides, he got into the business to try and sort himself out. He'd actually been apprenticed to Franklin's, the tailors, who I think later went on to do Franklin's Garden. Then he was brought into the business under one of his uncles, and then eventually he became the chairman of the business by 1860. Now, he was mightily annoyed that the company's preeminence was being challenged. So he gathered the family together and he drained the coffers of all the other arms of the Phipps business, and he commanded in his imperious way that the brewery should be completely rebuilt to the absolute most modern standard, just to show those up the road who was boss, because bear in mind, they're virtually neighbours. There were just a few workshops between them. So if we move on to our next slide, and this slide is sort of the pivotal one, shows the picture. Now, the old brewery, the 1817 brewery, is actually not in this picture. I mean, it wasn't knocked down, but they've sort of airbrushed it out in a sense. It's a lovely picture of an idealized aerial view of the new 1868 brewery that the Phipps family built. It was massive. It was twice the size of the NBC brewery. It was bigger. It was better. They really threw everything at it to retain or regain the crown of being the preeminent brewer in the area. It had 2 yards, which was unusual, top yard, bottom yard. And again, you can see it's still the era of horse-drawn carriages. But those of you that have either got better eyesight than me or that can zoom in, you can actually see the Northampton to London railway line just at the level of the rooftop at the back. And on full-size pictures of this, you can see a tiny little representation of a very early steam train of the London North Western puffing away down to London. So this building came on stream in 1868. Now you've got the best brewery in the area, bar none, and that was the proud boast. And what you needed to go with this best brewery was a beer that was really going to show off your talent, your skill, your ability, and your financial clout. So this is all recorded in his own diary and in company history written at the time. Pickering commanded his head brewer, a guy called Thomas Manning. He brought him in and said, "There you go, Mr. Manning. I have built you the finest brewery. Now go and brew me the finest beer possible, whatever it is, whatever cost, just make it the best bloody beer, just so those sods up the road know that we mean business." And it's not generally thought that by this point, Pickering was a brewer himself. He'd just become a businessman, even though his father and grandfathers had been the brewers. Pickering was not one. So he left Tom Manning to think about what would be the best beer. And Tom goes away and he comes up with one of these newfangled hip beers called India Pale Ale. Now, apologies if people listening to this know exactly what that is, but it all goes, I'll give you a brief potted history of IPA, India Pale Ale. So obviously the jewel in the empire's crown in the 19th century was India. And a lot of British troops and a lot of British people were out there. And India at that point, before the invention of electronic and, well, to some extent gas-powered early refrigeration, you couldn't really brew in India. So beer was shipped out to India. But generally, certainly in the hot summer days and before the Suez Canal was opened, they found it would spoil by the time it got to India. But just by luck and by trial and error, there was a beer brewed by a brewer called Hodgkinson's in Bow, which had a number of odd characteristics. And it was an odd beer compared to everything else at the time. And nobody quite knows why they produced this beer. First of all, it was quite sweet. It had sugar in. And as we know, if we're jam makers and chutney makers, sugar preserves. It had a higher than average hop content. And hops are, to some extent, a disinfectant. So the more hops you have, the longer your beer lasts. And it used a lot of malt, so it's quite thick, even though it was still golden, which meant it could be stronger. And this beer wasn't called IPA at that point, but this beer was found to last. So this became India Pale Ale. And also it slightly had less, solid malt into it in suspension. And that is where it actually started to go off. Hot beer will go off from the malt. So this beer survived. So it became India Pale Ale. It was sort of like a Vindaloo of beers. Today there's been sort of hop inflation, if you like. But beers in the 19th century weren't very hoppy. We would not recognize them to some extent. They would be porters, they'd be milds. So an India Pale Ale was quite an affront to the taste buds of your average Victorian. So it was a niche beer. It was a beer that you made for India. It was a beer that you made if you wanted to go, I'm going to have an India Pale Ale. Ooh, really? That's a very hoppy thing. But into our story, again, in the ever looping story of history, comes the shoe industry, which is obviously the major employer in Northampton and the county. Now, if any of you have worked in a shoe factory or been through or even gone to, a gentleman's old-fashioned shoe shop, that smell of tanning, that smell of leather, the leather dust, that dulls your taste buds. So the average boot and shoe worker in the pre-Clean Air Act days would come out of a hard 8.5-hour shift, and it was generally thought that you wouldn't taste the first couple of pints because you had to clean all that horrible clag out of your nose and out of your mouth, except for India Pale Ale, which was a very strong and tasty beer. So whether by design or chance, we won't know, Mr. Manning's decides to celebrate the opening of the new Phipps brewery by brewing an India Pale Ale. But he brews it in a sort of general session. It's not too extreme. And it goes really well in Northamptonshire. And beer writers of the time note that in Northamptonshire, India Pale Ale is the most popular beer. It is the best bitter. It's the beer that those funny people in Northamptonshire drink. Because elsewhere around the country, in Birmingham, they're drinking milds. In Newcastle, they're drinking brown ales. In Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, they're drinking the sort of Tetley, Mansfield, heavy-duty beers. In the garden and agricultural counties, they drink very light ales because they want to replace the liquid. But in Northamptonshire, they drink IPA because it's got a lot of hops in. And that's the story of Phipps IPA and Tim Manning. The next slide, please, sir. I hope this pace is going to hit the time we're at. So it's a lovely aerial photograph, I think from the 50s. So Tim Manning produces this beer that is absolute success. Phipps becomes yet again the preeminent brewer in the area. Everybody is going for their beer now. And NBC just continues to do its Star Ale, which was a much more brown and bitter, which we still do. So after about 5 years, Tom Manning walks into Pickering Phipps' office and says, please, sir, I have created this really fabulous, famous beer. It's going really well. I've done everything you asked. May I have a pay rise? And Mr. Pickering Phipps said, bugger off. Not on my watch, you don't have a pay rise. I'm paying you well on a threepence farthing a year or whatever it was. So this didn't sit well with Tom Manning. And Tom Manning eventually decides to strike out on his own with a little backing from some of the Northampton guys. And he starts Manning Brewery. And if we're looking at this aerial photograph, slightly blurred, I'm afraid, but I can't afford to download the expensive original. Manning's Brewery is there, not far from, on the far right, you can see St. Peter's Church. Next to it will be the Old Black Lion. And then in the very centre, that's where Manning's Brewery was, and the Maltings, which was there for a bit longer. St. Peter's Way went past it, was there, because that's the navigable river down there, and you can see in the top left, you can see the goods sheds of the railway. Great place to put a brewery, and a better place to put a brewery now in the 1880s, because you're going to get most of your provisions and coal from the railway. So all of a sudden, Mr. Manning's very smart, and he starts a business up, and he becomes the next great brewing king. And having thought he'd dealt with NBC, Phipps suddenly had Manning's to deal with. So if we go on to the next slide, there was another brewer on Bridge Street, again attracted by exactly the same good connections, basically river connections, Ratliff and Jeffrey. And those of you that know the Albion Brewery, that is still our brewery to this day, the 1883 extension of Ratliff and Jeffrey's Albion Brewery. The company actually started before in 1860, and the Ratliffs were originally farmers in the Harpole area. They were pig farmers, and they grew malt for pig feed. And then one of the sons, William Ratliff, starts to produce maltings in Semilong, and he produces stout. Mr. Jeffrey was a maltster as well. They joined together, and the Jeffreys were obviously a big Northampton family. I believe they are the same people as Montague Jeffrey. They were business people. Mr. Jeffrey was the businessman. Mr. Ratliff was the brewer. And they had a neat line, and their speciality was the stout. Ratliff stout was a very big seller in Northamptonshire, as stout was generally in 19th and early 20th century Britain. It was a very much a popular beer. So these are the great Northamptonshire brewers: Manning's, Ratliff and Jeffrey, NBC and Phipps. There was another one, Lion Brewery, over in Far Cotton, but that was taken over by NBC. And there was another brewer in Abington, which lasted through until 1963, but they never really did much, the Abington brewers. So if we move on to the next photograph, here we have the Ratliff family. In the center is old Mr. Ratliff, who, unlike the colourful image of Pickering Phipps, was generally regarded to be a lovely, sweet man by those who knew him. That's his son standing tall over him, Richard Ratliff, and his grandson, William Ratliff. And I actually know very well William Ratliff's son, who is now living in Canada, who's a shareholder of our company still. Now, Mr. Jeffrey dies in, I think, 1897, leaving Mr. Ratliff running his business, but he's not really a businessman. But down the road, there was a businessman who he obviously knew, Pickering Phipps. So Phipps took over Ratliff's, slightly strong-armed, but it happened, and it was a merger of some extent. So from that point on, Phipps stopped producing their own stout, and they carried on producing Ratliff stout. The Ratliff family joined as board members, and Richard Ratliff became a director of Phipps. And Phipps brewed at the Albion Brewery. They owned it from 1899 until 1919. So it continued to be part of the Phipps empire. And if we go on to the next slide, here we come. Having said this isn't about the Old Black Lion, but I thought I'd put this in. Now, the Old Black Lion was interesting because it was one of the last brew pubs in Northampton. I started this story of the Phipps family originally having pubs, and all the pubs would have brewed in their back rooms and in the yards at the back and produced their own beer until the mechanization and industrialization allowed large-scale brewing to happen. And the Old Black Lion was a very old-fashioned pub even then, and it continued. And those of you that's been round it, I'm fairly certain that the brew house was in the little square brick area, which I think has been used as a bin store recently. If you go in through the back door, it's on the immediate left. You can tell that it's not got windows in it. It's got grills that would have left the carbon dioxide out. And looking at the plan of the place, it had its own small brewery there until right about the turn of the century. And when this photograph was taken, it would have been brewing its own beer. But if we move on to the next photograph, Manning's, whose brewery was obviously, you can see just down the road, you can just make out a wisp of smoke behind the newsagents, and Manning's Castle Brewery is just down there behind the people walking. So they took over the Old Black Lion. It became Manning's. It became, in a sense, their brewery tap pub. And it was interesting when the CCT were cleaning up the brickwork, you could still see evidence of the sign painted on the gable end that faces the churchyard. The Old Black Lion, Castle Ales, Ales and Stout, Manning and Co. And I advocated for getting it repainted, but I was shouted down, as in so many ways. But that would have been a lovely thing to do, I think. So Manning's did fine, did well. But again, when old Mr. Manning obviously ran his business almost out of spite because of the way he'd been treated by Pickering Phipps. But unfortunately, he died, as everybody has to in the end. I mean, I think he died in 1935, and his son pretty immediately sold the business to Phipps. And the well-known anecdote is that the son of Tom Manning sold the business in a deal and a handshake to the son of Pickering Phipps, who was also called Pickering Phipps III. And Pickering Phipps said, "That's the most expensive pay rise the company has ever given." Ha ha ha, how we laughed. What a wag. So we move on to the next photograph. That's my daughter calling. Hello, am I back?
Yep.
Jolly good. Jolly good. So we've now reached, although I skipped ahead to say what had happened to the Mannings, we reached the First World War. Now, Richard Ratliff was a major in the First World War in the Northamptonshire Regiment, which is interesting. And then he came out of the war and everything sort of went back to the way it was. But one of the things that happened in the war, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, was, and I think he was the munitions and the Chancellor before that, he was concerned, as many other wartime leaders were, that the troops coming home were just getting very drunk. And why wouldn't you after the trenches? And that possibly strong intoxicating liquor, given that Lloyd George was a teetotaler, would lead to ferment in the munitions industry, and there might be riots, and it was all a bit. So the government decided that they would force all the breweries to reduce their beers in strength, because beers at this point had been 5.5%, 6%. They were strong, and Phipps IPA was about 6.4%. So Phipps IPA was reduced in strength to 4.3 during the war. After the war, lots of other brewers actually put their beers back, but Phipps again found that at 4.3%, they were selling even more Phipps IPA. It became the standard strength of the British beer, and still is 4.2, 4.3. So after the war, things were going great. Pickering Phipps III died in 1932, and Richard Ratliff took over as chairman of the company, which is, in a sense, a nice thing for the guy to do. And one of the things that's interesting to note, that he was clearly had a strong bond with the Northamptonshire Regiment. And one of the things that happened to the company in the war, or on his personal say-so, most of the Northamptonshire Regiment's fighting was done in North Africa, part of the Desert Rats, and then in through Italy. So that's where they did their fighting. And the Red Cross parcels, Richard Ratliff canned Ratliff Stout, which was seen as, like Guinness was at the time, to be an energy drink and good for the troops. And at the company's expense, and it cost the company a fortune, but on his say so, they shipped Ratliff Stout out free to the Northamptonshire Regiment, which is a very lovely gesture. And when I was researching this, there were still one or two old guys that I met who said, oh, you know, we just look forward to those parcels. And there'd be letters from home, some chocolates, bags, and a can of Ratliff Stout. And it was a taste of home, a taste of Northampton. And it was allowed because it gave you energy, and you'd get up and you'd fight Rommel. So when I'm feeling particularly proud of the company and rather verbose, I would like to say that Ratliff Stout is the beer that won the Second World War. Because the turning point in the war, as I'm sure you serious students of military history would be, Tobruk and El Alamein. And those are battles that the Northamptonshire Regiment fought. And our brave lads would have had coursing through their veins Ratliff Stout. There you go. I'm going to claim the entire victory of the Second World War for Phipps. So if we move on to the next brewery picture. So this isn't the greatest picture, but I thought I'd include it because it's early colour, and we've had black and white up to now. This is actually a still from a film, which hopefully we're getting restored because it's a 1961 film that the company took of itself. And this is Bridge Street, as some of you may remember it, and we're now getting into the era I remember. I mean, I'm in my 60s, and the building in the centre is still there, although it is empty at the moment. That is the 1957 new offices that was built over the front of the top yard, which is why at this stage there are still entranceways for the lorries to go underneath the office building into the brewery yard. On the left, you can see the very tall 1868 Tower Brewery, and on the far right, you can see the NBC Brewery, which is now all the surviving workshops between NBC and Phipps have been bought up by each company. So they were basically facing each other or adjacent to each other. Now, the 1950s, in the way that things changed when coal and the canals arrived, things changed in the 1950s. And the two agents of change there are the motorways and commercial television. In the way that beer was moved and beer products and malt was moved around the country like coal on canals and then railways, in the 1950s, the motorway network was getting going and A roads were getting going, lorries were getting better. So you could start to think about having a larger area for your brewery. At this point, say 1955, regional breweries were developing. They were taking over smaller brewers. Phipps took over Campbell Praed in Wellingborough. NBC took over Eady and Dully in Market Harborough and Phillips in Stamford. Phipps took over Hipwells in Olney. And gradually they built an area that sort of worked on motor transport through lorries now. And this kind of pushed, when motorways started to happen, some of the smarter, bigger brewers started to realize that they could actually get even farther and the economies of scale could be even better. So smaller regional brewers were starting to be bought off by bigger brewers, often London breweries and often Burton-on-Trent brewers. So I think this was in the air in the 1950s, and you could nationally advertise now. You know, you could put your Whitbread bitter, try saying that with your dentures in, or your Ironcoop bitter on telly. And there was a Phipps advert, but it hasn't survived. I still dream one day someone's going to find it. They did do an ITV advert. So Phipps and NBC knew that they were slightly too small and they'd been rivals. They hated each other as companies. Certainly Phipps hated NBC. Even into my time researching this, I got to know some old Phipps and NBC men, and they would still argue in the pub. They're in their 80s. They would still argue over which beer was best. And if you were a Phipps brewer or senior manager and you were seen by another senior manager going into an NBC pub, you would be sacked in the morning. It was absolutely forbidden. NBC guys were slightly easier. They could go where they wanted. So they really didn't like you. You were one or the other in this town at that point. You were an NBC man, you were a Phipps man. So if we go to the next slide, what the two companies realized is that they really ought to merge. They're literally next door to each other. Other brewers were being bought up during the 50s. So they buried the hatchet, and the Second family and various other people in NBC made the overtures to Phipps, and eventually they decided to merge. By this point, Phipps was probably about 60% bigger, or 60%, and NBC was 40%, but NBC was more profitable. It was a very neat operation. It had modernized its brewery in the early 50s with new kit, whereas Phipps was still brewing on the 1860s kit, which is fine because they still do that in Shepherd Neame at the moment. But this shows you the combined trading area in 1959. And it gives you a good idea of how big the new merged company was. And it was a very big company now. They really felt they'd got big enough. So you can see they go right up to Spalding, Peterborough, down as far as St Albans, Oxford, Redditch. At one point, Phipps actually owned Molyneux, the ground of Wolverhampton Wanderers, through some Phipps, Phillips NBC family. Then basically Leicester, Nuneaton. And at the heartland, right in the middle, is Northampton. Very big brewery, very cozy, everything's right. However, and ladies and gentlemen, now if this was a pantomime, I'd be getting you to boo and hiss. I can't hear you, because into our story comes the pantomime villain. Next photograph, please. Oh no, sorry, the next photograph I've forgotten. I put this one in just to show the Phipps NBC star, because we've just included one of these in the Northamptonshire in 100 objects. It's the thing that first attracted me to the company. I loved that star, the neon star. I remember it as a kid shining over the pubs my gran used to drink in, and it's I think it is quite a beautiful design. I did a fine art degree, and I'll not hear a word said against it. And this is a photograph I actually took when I was at the foundation on the art course at Nen College in 1978, I think. So they were still here and there. They didn't get rid of them all. But now, having spiked my build-up, the next one is there. Watney's, boo hiss, boo hiss. Now, Watney's were Watney, Coombe and Reed. They were a London brewer doing what London brewers do, but they had quite an active R&D department and chemistry department, and more or less, they invented keg bitter. Up until the 1920s and 30s, pretty much every beer barrel was made of wood, because it had been made of wood for centuries, and that's what it was made of. Now, it's watertight, liquid tight, but it's not airtight, which is the whole thing that you get from maturing whiskey, because slowly air seeps out and the atmosphere affects what's in it, because wood is slightly porous, even hardwoods like oak, which most barrels are made of. But Watney's realized that if you made a barrel out of metal, and they started making barrels out of an aluminium alloy, you could pressurize them. You could make them airtight. And if you could pressurize them, they found out that you could, A, the beer would last longer, it wouldn't go off, and B, you could do away with a hand pump, and you could actually put a valve on top. And what the copyright they had, the patent, was on the valve system that went on these pressurized kegs, as it was called, and the spear that went in, so that you just flick the switch and the beer would be forced out by gas pressure. And that meant that oxygen didn't go into the barrel, and it's the oxygen that goes into the traditional cask ale that starts to turn it. So when you start opening traditional beer, it's got live yeast in it, But as soon as you open it, you've got 3, 4, 5, 6 days to serve it before it starts to head towards vinegar. Whereas keg beer can last 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So Watneys were rich. They'd invented this. Everybody else, like Worthington and Trophy and all these other people, were making it because it sort of worked in small bars and golf clubs and things like that, because the beer didn't require a cellar. It required more technical gear with it, but it would last longer. Watneys were very, very, very cash rich. And in the 1950s, they basically followed the motorways. And in the way that Phipps' original brewery happened a year after the Grand Union Canal opened, the motorway, the M1, reached Northampton in 1959. And in 1960, Watneys put a hostile bid in for Phipps because they realized they could supply the Phipps estate that you've just seen from London. And they did this all around the country a few years before, and for the next decade, right through to the early 70s, Watneys bought 12 different breweries, some very famous, some very well-known names. And why I say they're a comedy baddie is that they always arrived. They always did their PR. They always told the shareholders, we're going to keep local beer brewing. We're a light touch. We'll just help you sell more of your beer. You can just put a few Watneys Red Barrels on, but it'll be okay. It'll be fine. It was all, pardon my French, every single brewery they bought, eventually they closed. And it was quite what the people were doing in the late 60s, when it was quite obvious that this is what Watneys' business plan was. So most of the Phipps family, and the Phipps family who are now involved with our company, left in 1960s. They didn't want to sell. One member of the family, Guy Phipps Walker, stayed, and the two halves of the family have never spoken to each other since. He was viewed as a quisling. He was viewed as someone who was either gullible or took Watney's coin, and he stayed as chairman of the company, whereas Jeremy's grandfather left, who is our current chairman, and went into Chamberlain Phipps. So Watneys immediately started changing things. Bit by bit, year by year, they got rid of the traditional Phipps brewing, and some great beers went in the early days, and they turned the top of the brewery, the old Embassy brewery, into the Red Barrel brewery and started making Red Barrel. And they gradually reduced year by year all the independents. And one of the lovely old brewers, Pat Heron, he got out in 1966 because he knew what was coming. He could see the way it was going. So they wanted the pub estate. They really didn't want the brewery. So next slide, please. So again, we're now into my era, in a sense, because I took this photograph again when I was at college. I was very interested in the design of signs, and this shows Man's Cream Label Stout, Phipps's beer, Watneys Ales. So for a while in the mid-60s, it looked like maybe they were going to just have Watneys Red Barrel Keg, Phipps IPA, and Man's Stout, and Man's Special Bitter. But it was a brief interlude. So this sign will come from around 1966, I think, looking at the signs. And it's an off-license that still had them proudly on in 1979, many years after Phipps had gone. I wish I'd taken a slightly better photograph, but there you go. So if we go to the next slide. So unfortunately, inevitably, Watneys had done a deal with Carlsberg to have Carlsberg bottled and canned lager and then keg lager in all their pubs. So it started off like that. And the British, the British servicemen in the Rhine had got used to drinking lager, which wasn't a particularly British form of beer, although there's some old established British lager companies like in Wrexham and Bohemian Brewing. And the British American Brewing Company in Abington was actually producing lager. But Carlsberg were one of the sort of vanguards, along with Heineken, of putting lager into Britain. And they were sort of working with Watney Man, as it was at the time. And then it became obvious that the lager market was growing and growing. And if they could brew in this country, that would be a good thing. Everybody would make money. So it's not generally known, but it was that Carlsberg taking over the site was actually a joint venture. It wasn't sold to Carlsberg and they built it. Watney's and Carlsberg actually conspired, I would prefer to say, to knock down the Phipps Brewery. And this is a lovely painting, which is in the possession of the museum by John Newcomb, I think, of the original Phipps Brewery, or the 1868 brewery, which you can possibly recognize actually being demolished in 1972. So that's the tall building that you've seen in the colour pictures, and the tall building that's on the Victorian poster. And the sort of square building behind the crane to the right is the office block that's still there to this day. So that went down, and strange enough, they didn't actually build Carlsberg on Phipps. They built it on what we call the Balls Home, which was at best a sort of rough cricket ground and football ground over an arm of the river. But they diverted the river to make a larger site, because Phipps had bought the Balls Home some time ago, so it belonged to them, but I don't think they did anything with it. And for 2 years, they carried on brewing in what was the old NBC brewery whilst Carlsberg was being built. So next slide, please. And what a lovely picture this is. And what a tragic picture. So you can see what was as built by Ratliff and Jeffrey. That's the Crown Maltings, although a lot of people call it the Brown and Panks building because that was a subsidiary of Phipps, a wine warehouse. Behind it is the big new Carlsberg brewery. This is Southbridge. Now, my father comes into the story at this point. My father's interested in history, and he was working at Nen College at this point. And he was just generally interested because my grandfather had been a brewer at Praed's, and he sort of he kept an eye on all this. Carlsberg and Watney's unveiled in 1972 this wonderful new architect's model of the new brewery they were going to build. You know, those lovely architects' model. It was in the Chronicle and Echo, and everyone went, well, that looks beautiful and lovely. But what this model didn't show was the Brown and Panks building, which even then was listed. So my dad was one of the people, and I'm sure quite a few people did, that actually got in touch with the town planning officer and said, it looks like they're trying to knock this down. They can't, it's a listed building. So the Secretary of State at the time, I forget who it was appealed to by various people, and it was pointed out that by Carlsberg that they couldn't knock this part of the brewery down, which clearly annoyed them. They'd got this one, as far as they were concerned, wonderful new brutalist building, but there was this Italianate building. Now, Bill Urquhart, who was the last Phipps head brewer in the last few years, was trying desperately to convince Watney's to just keep some traditional brewing in Northampton. He said, you know, people do not want oil keg beer. You're wrong. People still want Phipps IPA around here. You could have a small brewery just in this little bit that would just supply enough. But Watney's were very much involved in the future. They thought traditional brewing was the past, and they thought their brewing, and they were working on something called continuous brewing, which actually did for the company, where you'd basically have just a large cylindrical brewer. You'd put the water and the ingredients at one end, and it would sort of come out the other end in a continual conveyor belt. And they were convinced this was going to revolutionize brewing in the way that keg beer had revolutionized it in the 30s and 40s. So they just basically sent poor Bill Urquhart off, at one point apparently quite humiliating him in a meeting, just saying, you're a fool, you're old-fashioned, this is all gone, no, we don't want this. So again, some of you might be of an age to remember this building, remember what happened. Carlsberg kept appealing to knock it down, and they kept getting knocked back. And as you can see, it's a beautiful building. It really ought to have been saved, like so many of Northampton buildings. But as is so often the way, and has happened recently, I believe, both up Bridge Street and on Sheep Street with an empty building that's listed, there was a fire. But do you know when the fire was? I mean, I can't hear you, so I'm acting like I'm a teacher. Go, can you tell me when the fire? When would you most profit from having a fire in a building you wanted to knock down? You would do it in the middle of the firemen's strike in 1978, when the Green Goddesses were on the road and the army was around. It stank to high heaven, bluntly. It stank to high heaven. So there was a fire. There were no trained firefighters, and the building became unsafe, and they knocked it down. And that, I think we should never forgive them for. So moving on. This is a photograph of the last surviving Phipps crew, a much denuded crew because Phipps was bigger. So this is brewers on the very last day of brewing in May 1974. Now, the gentleman in the middle in the dark mac with his hands on his thighs, that is Guy Phipps Walker. The guy next to him with the pipe is Billy Walsh, the brewer. The guy to his left, our right, is Bill Urquhart, the small, bold gentleman in the light suit. Then it's Mr. Hipwell on the right there. The chap in the top right-hand corner in the pale sweater and with a beard is Robin Seawood, who I got to know quite well. His father had been a head brewer there. And most of the guys there are the older guys who were just hanging on, because the newer guys had gone and started work at Carlsberg. And most of the workforce at Carlsberg were Phipps men. These are the guys who did the last few years before retiring, plus some very young people that were just casual labour. And they all look very happy, which is odd, but that's the end of brewing on Bridge Street, or ale brewing on Bridge Street. But it's not the end of Bill Urquhart. Now, Bill Urquhart had lost the battle with Watness. And in that wonderful, plucky British, and he was Scottish originally, way, he was not going to take it lying down. There's some thought that he'd been blacklisted as a troublemaker by Watness. A lot of the other Phipps brewers had been given jobs around the Watney Empire in other brewers, but not Bill. So if we move on to the next picture, I may be overrunning, but do yawn if you feel you need to go. Bill Urquhart, wonderful, wonderful fella. Basically, he nicked bits and bobs of kit. Nobody cared in the last few years at Phipps. Nobody cared. You could walk away with bits if you wanted to walk away with bits, because it was all coming down anyway. Why wouldn't you? And Bill lived in a large house in Lichborough, and there was a barn out the back. And in the barn, he gradually collected bits and bobs of Phipps kit that they didn't want. Some he paid a few quid for, some just went out up his coat. Next to him is his neighbour, who was a young engineer called Frank Kenner. And Bill Urquhart built the world's first microbrewery. This is the era now of CAMRA. And Jean and I were talking about CAMRA before we started this. So CAMRA had come in on the scene to fight the closure and the ending of traditional British brewing and to fight the spread of keg beer. And Bill realized that there was going to be a market for it. So he invented processes. He went to the suppliers and got them to supply him with smaller quantities than they would do. There'd been a couple of small pubs elsewhere that had started their own small brewery, and the Selby Brewery was reopened by a branch of CAMRA. But Bill built the first microbrewery in the world. And he ought to be, there should be a statue of him in Northampton, because he changed the history of brewing and the history, in a sense, of our high streets. He was part of that CAMRA revolution. Lichborough Brewery started in 1976, I think. Bill retired in 1980, and he then built a brewery for the British government on Ascension Island to supply the Falkland Islands and the troops going there. And all his welding and everything was done by Frank Kenner. And sadly, I never got to meet him. He died in 2006. I was hoping to go up and see him in Edinburgh in retirement, but he wasn't well. And by the time I could go, I'd missed him. But he was loved by the staff. He was a genial, cheeky chap. And there's a lovely, if I may tell you a lovely story. So in the dying days of the brewery, when Carlsberg is being built over a fence and the old NBC brewery is still going and Bill's the head brewer, Bill was getting bits and bobs and everyone knew what he was doing. They knew he was up to something and they were behind him. Now, one of the most expensive bit of kit in a brewing is a heat exchanger. It's where you take the heat out of one day's brew and you store it in a hot liquor tank for the next day's brew. It saves you lots of money. And these things are kind of expensive. So Bill goes down into the spares department and says to a guy called Lindsay, who I've met, Bill came down looking to see if there was a heat exchanger anywhere in the brewery that might work. But everything was knackered and the only one there was too big. And he sort of left slightly despondent, thinking he was going to have to really fork out for them. But the guys in the spares department wanted to help him. So one of them said, I know where there's a lot of new heat exchangers over the fence in Carlsberg. So after work, they nip out to Carlsberg, give the guy some bottles of Phipps, and they sneak out a heat exchanger. They get it back to the workshop and they grind off the word Carlsberg and made in Denmark. And then the next day they go and see Bill in his office and they say, Bill, we found one. We found one at the back of the storeroom that's new. It was ordered a while ago by Dusty, your predecessor, and we never used it. And they gave it to Bill, who went, oh, brilliant. And he goes off and he installs it. And he never knew. And they never told him that it was stolen from Carlsberg, which I think is a lovely story and shows the man and shows the plucky Northamptonshire workers rooting for the little man. So if we go on to the next slide. So I drank Litchfield beer when I was at college, and I was tutored into it by my grand going, now this is real beer and this what is stuff is muck and blah, 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 blah. So I'm alive at this point. So I think I mentioned at the beginning of this, my brother had Phipps as a company called Watney Man Midland, and then Mann's Northampton Brewery Company, then Cellador Limited, then Shefflin Brewer, continued as a pub chain, the same company. Guy Phipps Walker was still the chairman, but it was taken over by various people. Watneys were taken over by Grand Met Hotels, who merged with Guinness to become Diageo. Then it was sold to Courage. Then it was sold to Foster's. Then it was sold to, I think, Scottish and Newcastle. So turn of the century, my brother was running the pub chain, had this idea. Everyone still talks about Phipps IPA. Let's rebrew some. Oh no, we haven't got the recipe. We don't know what to do. Call Alaric up. He likes digging in archives. So I get on board with it. And we start doing the work on it. But then Scottish and Newcastle get into trouble. And the plug was pulled. But I'd already done the research. And I'd met some of these old brewers. And I'd got the recipe. But the Pubco was sold to Punch in Burton-on-Trent in 2004. And my brother was asked to go and be seconded to help the company integrate into Punch taverns. He didn't want to go, but he went down to a meeting in London just to sort of, he didn't want to go, but he said, like everything, there's a price. If they give me the price, if they give me what I asked for, I'll go, because I've got kids in Northampton. I don't want to live in Burton for 6 months. So I've got to be put up in a hotel. I want my company car. You know, I want a pay rise. I want this, that, and the other. And I suggested, out of almost as a joke, because we were having a chat, and I said, why don't you ask for the company? Why don't you ask for Phipps? And why don't you ask for my research, which I finished and handed over? You know, and we'll do this, because my dad had got kind of happy that there was going to be Phipps IPA again, and then it was all gone. I said, we can do this. We can get this sorted. We can just get it brewed by someone. And that someone would be Dusty Miller and Tony Davis in that photograph. And my brother said, don't be daft, they'll never do that. But he goes to the meeting and they give him everything he asked for, and he couldn't think of anything more to ask for. So he asks for the company. They didn't even know they owned the company name or the star logo. And he walked out of the meeting with it, handed it over to me and said, there you go. What are we going to do with it now? So Dusty Miller was Bill Urquhart's original boss. That's the big man on the left. and he was the head brewer from the early 60s until 1972. He then very unhappily went to Carlsberg for 2 years, hated it, and then he went to Ruddles in Oakham, and his deputy head brewer was a guy called Tony Davis. So Pat Heron, one of the old Phipps guys we know, said, if you're going to brew this beer, you should get Tony Davis to do it because he's trained by Dusty, one of the great old Phipps head brewers. So if we go to the next photograph. Okie dokie. There we go. So there's me drumming up trays. So we started doing it as a hobby. It was Phipps IPA was brewed at Grain Store in Oakham, and we thought maybe we'd just do one batch of it. My dad would have a pint, my uncle would have a pint, everyone would say we'd done well, and then we'd get on with the rest of our lives. But it sold really well. So then we did another batch, and then we did another batch, and then I ended up kind of selling it for a bit in between. I was a sound engineer touring, and in between tours, I would do a bit of work on the company. We soon realized there was a business here. We'd got in, the Phipps family had got in touch with us to buy some beer off us. So we knew 2 or 3 of them, and they're all lovely guys with plenty of deep pockets. And we decided we were going to start a brewery, a proper one that would be our own. We looked at Toaster Mill, which is where Phipps had started for a while. And we did all the design work on that. But then the building in the picture came up, which is the Albion Brewery on Kingswell Street. The last surviving traditional brewery building in Northampton, sold by Phipps in 1919 to James Brothers, where it made lemonade and mixed tea and coffee, and then it became a leather dressers. And it went on the market the year when we were planning to do this. Next photograph. And it was, to his eternal credit, this is Jeremy Phipps. He is the 6th great-grandson of Pickering Phipps. And he had been an accountant and a hedge fund manager in the city. So he was very proud of his heritage. Always kind of missed the fact that the family didn't own the brewery anymore. And his father had got in his ear about what a tragedy it had been. So Jeremy comes on board and says, right, I'm going to help raise the finance. We're going to restore this building. We're going to become a proper brewer again. We're going to have our own Phipps brewery. I'm going to be the chairman. And we all said, yes, Jeremy. Absolutely fine. He's a lovely guy. He looks strangely like Pickering Phipps, actually, from a certain angle. Slightly more hair and slightly nicer temperament. Next photograph. I'll speed through a bit. The building's completely empty and derelict. The roof was leaking. It was a terrible thing. It was close to being knocked down. We spent a fortune doing it. Not as much as the old Black Lion has spent, but we repaired it. We sandblasted all the walls. We cleared it out. We cleared the cellar out. We dug things out. We put all the wiring back, all the waterworks back, the lighting back. Basically, it was just an empty building with nothing because all the wiring had been ripped out. And we became a proper brewer again in 2014. Next picture. And here we are. And if you cast your mind back, the gentleman on the left in the blue shirt, that's Frank Kenner, who had been a partner at Lichborough Brewery. So it was a nice link with Bill Urquhart. He came on board, and Frank is working at the brewery even today in his 80s. That's Mel, who was our original manager, who'd been at Grain Store. John Smith was Tony's deputy at Grain Store. So he was trained by Tony Smith, who was trained by Dusty Miller, who was trained by Mr. Seawood, who was trained by Mr. Phipps. So there's a continuous training in that man's. There's Roy from Hogley's, the big chap at the back. I'm the chap in red. My hair's gone grey since then, and that's my brother, who wanders in and out, who went on to work for Hilton Hotels. And there we are, celebrating the fact that we've got a bar and a pub, and Phipps IPA is back. And the next photograph is the end piece, ladies and gentlemen. That's the Phipps NBC star shining over Northampton, as it should do forever, because it's a fine pint of beer and it's part of local character, and I'm very proud that I had a hand in bringing it back. So I think that is something like 5,000 years in probably about an hour.